Okay, welcome everyone to today's virtual Advances for Field Experiments seminar. We are very happy and glad to have Leo Bursztyn giving his talk today. Leo is Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, and today's talk will be on misperceived social norms, women working outside the home in Saudi Arabia. So thank you all for joining. The same kind of rules applies as every previous week so far. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A box. Feel free to upvote the questions that you would like to ask. And then John and I will interrupt Leo at the most opportune times to answer your questions and to ask any further questions. I think Leo's talk will last around about 50 minutes, and then we'll have definitely around 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So thank you all for joining, and thank you to Leo and the co-authors for joining as well. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Good day, everyone. I trust that all remain safe, healthy, and productive. Today, we are doing a little bit of home cooking with our speaker, my colleague, Leo Bursztyn. I've known Leo since he was a grad student. I met him when he was originally on the job market. He came to the University of Chicago and on the 09-10 market. And I quickly came to admire Leo, and it was easy for me to forecast why he would become a star. Now, we made a big mistake the first time. We didn't hire him, but when I became chair, we actually had a second chance and we didn't make the same mistake. We hired Leo back in 2016. He's been my colleague at the University of Chicago ever since. And recently, last year, he was promoted to full professor with tenure. Now, when you look at Leo's work, I think it's fair to say he has a great knack for taking seriously the truly interdisciplinary nature of many problems. His past work lies at the intersection of behavioral econ, Devo, and political economy. Most of his work combines intelligently field experiments with observational data to essentially understand an individual's economic decisions and how they're shaped by the relevant social environment. Now, his studies not only pinpoint whether one's behaviors are affected by the social environment, but also the whys behind it, which I think is incredibly neat. Now, my favorite aspect of his work is that it typically connects to an economic theory that's closely linked to the empirical environment, and that allows a much more convincing approach to disentangle competing theories, and it allows them to separate the underlying channels and mechanisms at work in a much richer and more intelligent way than only using observational data would. Then he's allowed and permitted to generalize using that theory in a way that is, I think, incredibly unique in this area. So I think what you're going to find today is that the flavor of Leo's work will be running through today's talk, which is on a very fascinating topic. And it's joined with Alessandra Gonzalez and David Drote. And Alessandra is with us today as well. So Leo, thanks a lot for coming. Leo's in California right now, and I'm here in Chicago. But Leo, thanks for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. And thank you for the very kind words, John. So let's get started. So as both John and Rob mentioned, Alessandra is also here attending. So if you guys, want to also direct questions to her or write to her, feel free. So this is Misperceived Social Norms, Women Working Outside of Home in Saudi Arabia, joint work with Alessandra Gonzalez and Devi Drote. So let's get started. Let's see if I get my thing to work. One sec. All right, sorry. So just before getting started, I just wanted to give you some background information about the setting we're studying before we get, I pose the question and the motivation and the specific questions we're studying here. So if you talk to people in Saudi Arabia or if you study a little bit the setting, you would get the idea that laws and norms work as potential constraints to female labor supply in the country. We still have today the custom of male guardianship being practiced Essentially, if a woman is married, her husband is her guardian, otherwise her father is the guardian. And women still need written permission from a male guardian to do a number of things, including working outside of home. This actually used to be the law until a few years ago. So before getting a job outside of home, a woman was required to get written permission by her husband or her father. This is no longer the law, but it's still often practiced as a custom in the country. As you may all know, until very recently, women were also not allowed to drive in the country. This ban on women driving was lifted in 2018. So it's not entirely surprising that at the end of the day, you have a very low level of labor force participation by women, under 20%, one of the lowest in the world. But if you zoom in and look at the act of working outside of home, which is actually an observable action, right? If you work from home, it's less observable by others. This is even lower, substantially lower. For example, if you look at the national survey we conducted in 2018, only 4% of women were working outside of home. So it's a very low rate. So that's the background, right? That's the backdrop. Now, consider opinions on whether women should be allowed to work outside of home. So the question you're going to be asking here is whether Saudi Arabia is experiencing pluralistic ignorance. So what is pluralistic ignorance? So this is an older concept from social psychology, which describes a situation where privately most people hold an opinion, but incorrectly they believe that most other people hold a contrary opinion and therefore end up acting against their own view. Let me motivate you with an example. Suppose that 15 years ago, I was supportive of same-sex marriage, but I had the perception that most people around me were against it, right? And this is a world where I care about my social image, okay? I care about how people judge me and so on. So suppose I will say, go interact with John 15 years ago, and I would support same-sex marriage, but I had the impression that he was against it because that's my perception about most other people. So, and if I'm worried about how he's gonna judge me, I would not tell him my opinion. I would just either not talk about it or pretend that I was against it because I was worried that John would judge me negatively, okay? So he would not learn that in fact I was supportive of same-sex marriage because I would not talk about it. Likewise, he could also be supportive of same-sex marriage, but also hold the same incorrect perception and also not talk about it. So we could both be supportive, but because of our prior, would not talk about it and therefore not learn that the other person held the same opinion. So that's the idea of pluralistic ignorance when you take this to a macro level. So people start from a strong perception that they're part of a minority when in fact they aren't. So that's the idea. But the interesting thing about pluralistic ignorance is that the moment we learn that we actually were wrong in terms of our perceptions, behavior can change really fast, right? If there was a referendum or a vote or a poll, about the share of people who support same-sex marriage, I'll learn, oh, in fact, actually many people are supportive of it. So I guess I don't need to pretend I'm against it. So that's kind of the idea. So we formalize this idea. Actually, there's a companion paper, there's a more theoretical paper where we show that this aggregation of information can lead to very fast changes in norms and behaviors. And we consider one such type of aggregator, which is elections, right? For example, as I described, if there's an election where a topic is salient, you look at the votes and you learn something about how society thinks of a topic. So that one is a pretty depressing paper. It's a paper where we show that Trump's rising popularity and eventual victory in the 2016 presidential elections led people to update about the popularity of xenophobic views in the country. They realized, well, if these things were really fringe, he wouldn't be getting so many votes. If he's getting so many votes, it must be that these things are not really fringe. So if these things are really fringe, I don't need to be quiet about it. I can just talk about it as a xenophobe. So that's the paper, the other more depressing paper. So this paper, we take this idea to a different setting, in a setting that I think is very interesting and also challenging, which is a non-democracy, right? There's not going to be a vote or referendum on whether women should be allowed to work outside of home in Saudi Arabia. So it's much harder for this information to be aggregated naturally through an election process or even from the dissemination of opinion polls and so on. So naturally, you think in a democracy, these misperceptions would be corrected eventually, but in a non-democracy, this is much harder to achieve naturally. So the question we're going to ask here is that, are we in a situation where men overestimate how opposed other men are to women working outside of home? And if so, if these norms are misperceived, what happens when you correct these beliefs? Does it actually lead more women to work outside of home? So are we in a situation men are like closeted progressives in that sense. They would like women to work outside of home, but they just think that most other men are against it. And if that's the case, what happens when you correct these misperceptions? If that's the case, that women are more likely to get jobs outside of home once you correct these misperceptions, this is an indicator that social norms are indeed a potential obstacle for women working outside of home in Saudi Arabia, but also simple provision of information can promote employment outside of home for women in the country. Okay, so that's what we're going to be studying. I must say, this is not a paper where we're going to try to study the origins of the misperceptions. In fact, we have a simple model in the appendix where we take as a given there's a starting point that there's a misperception, and we show how it can persist in equilibrium and how correcting these beliefs can actually lead to behavioral change. But we're not going to be investigating the origins, the root causes of these misperceptions. I'm happy to discuss during Q&As, potential stories or such ideas of future research that could be done on the subject, but that's not going to be the subject here. All right, so so this is a paper that—
Leo, quick question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So there's an anonymous question that says, conceptually, is there any difference between pluralistic ignorance and hypocrisy?
This is a very good question. I mean, we don't usually use the term hypocrisy in economics. I'm not going to go meta here, well, in a way, I mean, yes. I mean, this relates. There's like there is a related concept by Timur Kuran on preference falsification, right? So so I guess you could say it's related to hypocrisy in the sense that you're not expressing, acting in accordance with your view. So you think A and you say minus A. So yes, I agree. That could be seen as some sort of hypocrisy. Yeah. Yeah. All right, I'll go ahead. So this is a paper that has—
Leo, just one further question about the context that you're working in.
Sure.
A question by Philippe Augusto is, can you talk a little bit more about why men in Saudi Arabia would not like others to know that they're in favor of women working outside of the home?
Okay, so as I said, we are not going to try to we also take a very reduced form stance on the existence of the social image cost. It's not a project where we microfound it. I mean, but of course we want to think about it. So, and then now I'm getting more speculative grounds because we don't have actual data on this, but the impression that we get, and by talking to people, and that's certainly something we would like to study. In fact, with Alessandra and others, we started investigating this before COVID hit, is this idea that one potential source of this cost is this idea that if other people see that my wife is working, they update negatively on my ability to be a provider, right? So if I need my wife to contribute to household income, it must be that my income alone is not enough. I'm failing as a provider. So there is this idea that there's this breadwinner norm that could be behind, this. But again, this is not something we're studying here. So I would love to say more about it. This is just a potential channel that we're planning to study in future work. So this is a paper that combines several pieces of evidence. We started, we kept adding new things. We started with what we can call our main experiment, our original experiment, which is an experiment with 500. I'll go in more detail later. This is just a preview, okay, everyone? This is an experiment with 500 married men in Riyadh. Were recruited in sessions of 30 participants from the same neighborhood. So those are people who know each other for the most. They're recruited from the same area, and they come into this site I'm going to show you, and we listed their opinions anonymously. And I'm going to emphasize how the care we had about making sure our results are not driven by experimental demand effects, and we did a bunch of other things in follow-up experiments. But our elicitation is whether they think women should be allowed to work outside of home. And then we incentivize them to guess how the other participants in the room, which are the neighbors, answer the same question. Okay, so their perceptions, and we pay them if they guess it right. And then there's a randomization where half of the participants within each session gets feedback on how the neighbors answer the same question. So we randomly correct these perceptions. And then we collect the first outcome. And, we wanted to make sure we collected an outcome on the spot while we still have experimental control before people could potentially communicate with each other, and when information spillovers could undo sort of the part of the intervention. But also we want an outcome that was a reviewed preference outcome, a costly choice. So we asked them to choose between signing up their wife for a job matching service, which I'll describe in detail, or an extra amount of cash payment, an Amazon gift card, just a simple choice. And then what we find, I mean, remember in Saudi Arabia, asking a man to sign up the wife for this type of service is not considered a very strange action, given the custom of male guardianship. So just to put it in perspective. Then our main experimental results, the results from this main experiment, we find that the vast majority of men in this setting support women working outside the home, while they vastly underestimate the support by others. When you correct these beliefs, you see a movement away from the cash payment and toward choosing the job service. We will interpret this as being driven by an update in the perceived acceptability of working outside of home. Of course, right now, you could correctly be saying, well, there could be other potential mechanisms here. Is it social learning? Maybe I'm updating about whether this is a good opinion to hold, or it could be a number of things. I'm learning something about the labor demand side of the labor market. We will discuss some of these confounds and how we work to deal with them. And so it's something I'm going to revisit. So I'm aware there could be a couple other things going on here. We'll interpret this as driven by an update in perceived acceptability. We'll revisit this when I discuss the talk. We also find an effect here on self-reported longer-term outcomes. So just to show that, to check whether this choice actually led to any real behavior change down the road, we followed up with the same participants. I'll tell you how exactly we did this in practice. And we find that the wives of the treated men were significantly more likely to have applied or interviewed for a job outside of home 4 months later. We're not powered enough to detect changes in employment rates. Directionally, it seems to be there. At least it goes in the right direction, but we're definitely not powered. So I'm going to refrain from saying those results. And I have to say this is self-reported outcomes. So one could say, well, could there be some interaction with experimental demand effects that they felt like they have to say, since they got treated, that they have to say? So there are a couple of concerns here. This is self-reported outcomes. We have some other interesting outcomes, persistence of the belief shock and so on, which I'll revisit it. But, this is the first set of evidence. Then, this is all nice and so on, but, one could say, well, maybe you guys happen to stumble upon the only sample of 500 men in Saudi Arabia for which this is true, right? You say you found 500 men in Saudi Arabia for which this is true. You would like to see something more general, right? I mean, imagine you were writing an abstract, and how do you write it? There's a sample of 500 men. That's not very compelling. So we replicate this finding with two larger national surveys, representative surveys of men of 18 to 35, which is also the age range we're studying there, where we find that there again, the vast majority of men support female living first participation inside of home, women working inside of home, but vastly underestimate support by others, okay? We also found a survey from the Arab Barometer back in 2010, 2011. It's the only year where this question was asked, and we find a very similar number there, which is consistent with the idea that this misperception might have been there for many years. The other thing we do in this replication survey is that we explicitly deal with social desirability bias. We try different types of elicitation methods. We try a list experiment that provide people with more cover and so on. I'll revisit that when I describe the results, indicating and the findings indicate that it's not driven by experimental demand effects. We also ask people, in one of these surveys, how often they discuss this subject with their male friends and peers. And we find that they're very rarely discussing the topic of women working outside of home. And more importantly, that those who discuss it less often have much stronger misperceptions. This is correlational, but, helps build the intuition that, of why, a pluralistic ignorance continues, persists, is because people are not really talking about the subject. Then, okay, one would think, okay, an interesting policy implication from this paper is that, potentially by correcting these misperceptions, you could actually make it easier for companies to hire women, to recruit women, and so on. So we could have stopped there, but we decided, not really we decided, but we were asked, that's more accurate as part of the revision process, to run such experiment. So we added to the paper a whole recruitment experiment with a survey company, where this is a survey company that typically hires women to do phone calls from home. So they are surveyors and enumerators that work from home. And now these companies offering these women the opportunity to switch to the same job, but outside of home and higher paying, 20% higher pay, plus all the costs being paid, transportation and so on, right? So it's a more profitable job and so on, but it has to be done outside of home. And then we randomize whether we inform women in the sample about the findings from our surveys, that in fact, most men actually support women working outside of home in Saudi Arabia. So just thus correcting misperceptions. This is more policies, less clean in terms of theory, because we get less in terms inside the black box, but just like taking this as, you know, like a proof of concept in terms of policy. That's it. So it's a natural field setting, and this is intervention with women. Until now, we were talking about men and so on. Now let's say, you know, trying to communicate directly with women. And we see a big increase in the rate of women that choose the job outside of home instead of the job from home. So when we hold the job fixed, we hold a bunch of things fixed, the company fixed, and just vary whether they're informed or not about these findings and whether the job is at home, outside of home. So correcting these perceptions could potentially expand the set of jobs available to women. So it's kind of like we go from the idea all the way to kind of the proof of concept of how to think of policy from this. Okay, so that's kind of so since I don't have a lot of time, this relates to a bunch of different literatures, from a theoretical literature on social norms to a lot of growing literature on gender labor markets, gender and identity and norms and so on, and the literature on social image concerns and so on. All right, so let's get started. I have half an hour, correct? Yes, okay. So let's see how far I can make. Let's talk about the experiment design for this main experiment, the results, and then talk about the national surveys, the 2 national surveys we conducted, plus the error barometer, and a discussion on the drivers of misperception, and then talk about the recruitment experiment, and then, if I have time, some concluding remarks. All right, so the goal here is not to develop a theory of misperceptions and their persistence in equilibrium. I refer you guys to our other paper, From Extreme to Mainstream, where we really develop, you know, a more careful framework and so on. In this paper, we have a sort of a toy model in the appendix. The intuition is very simple. If married Saudi men believe that a large share of other men are opposed to women working inside a home, and if they care a lot about their social image, they might end up not letting their wives work outside of home, even though most of them would prefer to have their wives work if the behavior were not observable. However, correcting these perceptions about the opinions of others could lead to big changes in the share of men willing to let their wives work outside of home. That's simple intuition as we described. So the experimental design. So I said a sample of 500 married males, all Saudi nationals, age 18 to 35. So I have to qualify this. We're going to be working with a youngish population here throughout, and in the QAs I can discuss how we think about this and potentially some data from other folks from the error barometer. This is in October 2017. They recruited from neighborhoods around Riyadh. We teamed up with a large international survey company but with a local presence and saw locals as they're used as enumerators and recruiters. We have 30 males in each session. I'll show you a picture in a couple of slides. We use this online survey platform Qualtrics, where we ask people their opinions regarding women work inside of home. As you might be anticipating, there might be potential concerns about experimental demand effects, and something we took seriously, both ex ante and exposed. Exposed, we did the list experiment elicitation randomly in the follow-up survey, but ex ante, we made sure this was anonymous. We made sure that the survey was not framed, you know, or the recruitment was not about the survey on women working inside of home and so on. You know, had a bunch of questions. This was a study on Saudi labor markets. We have a bunch of questions building up to the gender stuff. And when piloting, we also tried different framings and found no effect. reassuring given that it's anonymous. We also asked their beliefs about others' opinions. Asked them to guess how other participants in the room answer the same questions, and this was incentivized. So we paid them to guess it right. If we're worried about the payment in the incentivization, whether this could have generated some weird guesses, in the follow-up survey, we also randomized whether we paid or not, and I'll share the results. It doesn't matter. Yes, John.
Hey, Leo. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
My longtime co-authors has a question, so I owe him a call out. Glenn Harrison. Glenn, nice to hear from you. So Leo, here's what Glenn says. When you estimate beliefs about support by others, your incentivized scoring rule elicits the mode of someone's subjective belief distribution. Without eliciting and knowing the variance of that belief distribution, how can you say that it significantly underestimates anything? And then he says, kind of anticipating your answer, I think, please do not suggest that a hypothetical Likert response on confidence addresses this issue.
Well, you did anticipate. I mean, we had how confident you are about your guesses. Yeah, I mean, that is the method we used so we get their mean and then trying to get a sense of the variance by asking how confident they are. We could have been fancier, I guess, in the elicitation procedure. But I think we get a lot of traction, as we'll see, especially when you look at the heterogeneity of results. We see that the effects are driven by those who underestimated. So I'm going to show you a lot of heterogeneity results that give me confidence about the elicitation and also the follow-up experiment. I mean, let me get back to this, why I think, I'm confident of this elicitation procedure in light of our results, okay? But, I agree, there are more sophisticated approaches to this. We could have done something with more structure, take it more seriously, their beliefs and so on, not just the first moment. I agree. Why people from the same neighborhood? Well, we think that people should have relatively good information, existing norms. So we're not asking them to guess how people in a very different setting think about a subject, but their own neighbors. But also, this is a relevant peer group where your social reputation matters. So to the extent that there are misperceptions, correcting them shouldn't matter. So if it felt like natural to focus on people that know each other from the same neighborhood. Our first outcome, as I described, is an opportunity. The experiment ends with an opportunity to sign up. They make this choice between signing up for a job matching service specialized in the female job market or getting a $5 Amazon gift card. It's a simple choice. This is a service. So we teamed up with back then it was a startup in Saudi Arabia that had this, originally they had an app that helped women, connect with each other and find jobs and so on. So we discussed with them the opportunity of having kind of like a premium version of the app or that contain additional services, including weekly emails with jobs in their area, job links and so on. The opportunity to do like online resume writing workshops and a number of things. So this is service was being offered. And it was either that or a simple $5 Amazon gift card. Our goal here was like, okay, if we don't offer them a choice against something that is costly, we could just have a bunch of people say yes to what we're offering them, even though they were not interested, correct? And then we correctly think that most men actually want their wife to work outside of home, even though they're not really interested because there's no cost. So we just wanted to offer something small cost as an alternative, just to get rid of, to avoid people who are just saying yes just for the sake of saying yes. And as you'll see, this really worked because the control group take up was around 23%. So most men would actually prefer the $5 gift card to the service. I actually don't know how much this service would cost in the market. We were talking to them about, releasing it, so on. This service was not created eventually. The company got acquired by the government, so our ability to do experiments with them has been reduced, and including our ability to get administrative data and so on. Okay, so that's but that's our first outcome. We want to get a reviewed preference outcome while they're still in the experiment.
Leo, Yeah, just a quick question about thinking about the selection of the sample with regards to the neighborhood that you looked at and also using the app. So a question by Nathan Sclair, which is, do you anticipate or expect some sort of selection bias in the recruitment in the sense of those that are more inclined to take part in the study, use the app?
I agree.
They're the ones that are more likely to support the working outside the home.
I see. So I agree. So as I said, so a couple of things. By no means we're trying to sell this as a representative sample. That's part of the reason why we went at length to run these replication surveys with national samples. So yes, there's that. But also, I mean, I want to emphasize that these people were not recruited based on, to come to an experiment on women working outside of home. They did not know there was going to be an app being, there's just, it was a very different, the framing was not along those lines. They were invited to be part of a study on Saudi labor markets. We recruited them from 17 different neighborhoods in Riyadh, trying to get, throughout the income spectrum. But again, so there is a lot of variation in terms of the types of people we got. But again, I'm not going to try to sell this as a representative sample. It's also just coming from Riyadh and so on. But as you see, the numbers we get in terms of their opinions about women outside of home is remarkably stable across samples. Comparing this to the two other national surveys and to the Arab Barometer in 2010, you're always going to be hovering around 80% when answering the same question. It's remarkably stable across samples. It's not to say that this is representative, but the answers to these questions seem to match. So, okay, this is just a picture of a typical intervention. They were invited to come to conference rooms in hotels near their areas and so on. It's kind of in each one participating with their mobile phone and so on. Experimental design, very simple, straightforward given what I described. They come in. This is an interesting aspect here too, which is, this is an anonymous survey with us. We don't have their information, their numbers or names, but we wanted to make sure they could be recontacted. So the way this worked is that there was a sign-in sheet that the local surveyors collected names, phone numbers, and session numbers, right? And they kept this sheet. We don't have access to it. Then they go online and this becomes all anonymous. There's the demographics, these belief solicitation, and then there's a randomization. Half of people get no information, no feedback on others. Half gets the feedback. And then there's this job matching decision. At the very end, we also asked a question on the beliefs about the labor demand side to potentially deal with the confound of whether people are learning something about the labor demand side. When you tell me that men are supportive of women working outside of home, maybe I think there are more jobs for women. So maybe I think it's more worth it to go through the hassle of looking for a job because there are more jobs. So we try to rule out this confound. All right, so this is the actual script. Since I don't have so much time, just to describe, we asked them whether they agree with the statement. There are a couple other statements we tried to build up. In particular, do you agree with the following statement? In my opinion, women should be allowed to work outside of home. If you had to guess how many people among the 29 other study participants in this room do you think agree with the same statement? And we tell them if they guess most accurately, they get $20 and $20 Amazon gift card. We also ask a separate question, which is, in my opinion, women should be allowed to work in semi-segregated environments, which is a de facto. This is how work outside of home occurs in practice in semi-segregated environments. Just to make sure, we got similar numbers and numbers are virtually identical. So I'm not going to be showing this other one. Longer term. Okay, so let's go ahead.
Leo, just a quick question about the beliefs. There's a question by Ajinkia Keska asking, did you get any beliefs of the women themselves? Like what did they think?
Very good question. So not here. And to be honest, until we get to the recruitment experiment, which is with women, and there again, we don't have their beliefs, we just have they receive the information and it's their action. We don't have data on women. Other than, the Arab Barometer, women were asked whether women should be allowed to work outside of home, and 90% of them think they should, but we don't have measures of misperceptions by women. It's very interesting. It's very difficult to recruit women to come to an experiment like this. precisely potentially because of the norms that are misperceived. Now, we haven't run the meta experiment that you might be thinking about. Is it easier to run an experiment with women if you use your previous experiment as an intervention, right? We haven't done that. Luckily, we were not asked to do that one in our revision, but I think it will be very interesting. So the answer is no, unfortunately. But to the extent that the data exists for women, it seems that, that support this. We also had this follow-up calls, and had to be creative here because this is anonymous for us. But
I'm sorry. A quick question on interpretation.
Yes.
A person asks, is it possible that men in Saudi Arabia consider a cash payment to be haram or not acceptable to Islamic norms, and that's why they choose the WWOH option?
As you see, 77% of men choose the cash option. So I don't think it's
no, but it's not a question of levels. It's a question of interpretation.
Yes, that some people.
I think it's interpretation of what it means rather than just the level.
I see. So a couple of things. First, these are people who are recruited to participate in a survey based on a cash payment. So I would think that perhaps these is people that seem to be okay with cash payment for this. Now the other I think there are a couple of the things that we can use to rule out. And I think again the heterogeneity based on the direction and the size of the belief update. So unless you think that there are distaste for accepting this type of cash payment at that point correlates with their extent of their misperception about norms, then that could be seen as a confounder. I don't think it will be the case, but I'm happy to revisit this. So to get at this, we, as I said, there was the longer term follow-up, 4 to 5 months later. As I said, the company we worked with had the session names, the participants' names with their phone numbers and their session numbers. That's all they had. What we asked is the last 3 digits of the phone number for randomization purposes. So we had a data set with their answers, and next to each participant's ID, we knew their session number and last 3 digits of phone number. So this company reached out to the same participants by calling the numbers that they had, and then we asked them, the surveyor, to just put in, when they're filling out the script, Qualtrics, just to put in the last 3 digits of phone number and the original session number in the new data set. So we get a new data set with the information that we can use to match session number and last 3 digits of each participant's phone number. So even though they still have anonymity vis-a-vis us, so no one can see their names and their data at the same time, we can still match them across waves. We're able to have 82% of the sample recontacted with no evidence of selective attrition or differential attrition by treatment, both in terms of the outcome or in terms of demographics. There are 12 cases of 2 participants with the same last 3 digits within the same session. So we can't uniquely identify them. If I knew that, I would have asked for last 4 digits. That's kind of a dumb thing. But so there's that. And we collect a number of outcomes that I will discuss later on, with the caveat that they're all self-reported, okay? Let's talk about results. Average age, this is summary statistics of the sample, about 25 years of age. It's a young sample. 1.7 children average. Things seem to be pretty balanced across treatment and control groups. About half of them have a college degree. 80% of 85 are employed. And then we got this, first, and we were a bit shocked. When you asked them if their wife is employed or wife is currently working, 2/3 of them said yes. It was like, what's going on? That's not supposed to be. That's not supposed to be the case. Did we get an extremely weird sample? Did we just ask the question incorrectly? Luckily, it was the second option, and we learned, and we tried to partly correct for that in our follow-up survey. That if you ask if their wife was working, if the wife was working from home, they would say yes. If the wife was doing home production, they would say yes, which is consistent with people interpreting this question in light of the existing norms of a wife to work. If the wife is doing something, unless they have a maid helping at home, servant, they would say that the wife is working. So in the follow-up survey 5 months later, we asked them, was your wife working 5 months before? And if so, from home, outside of home, for pay or not, full-time or not. And we got a pretty good recall rate, reassuring. So exposed to try to uncover what they meant, and less than 10% of the wives of these participants were actually working outside of home for profit. So so that's just that's what about 5%. We'll see the number very soon. So again, so just how you asked the question was not correct. The average participant knows half of the other participants in the room, which is good because we wanted to get target people who knew each other. Okay, let's start with some figures. So this is just the first motivating figure. This is just plotting their perceptions across, so everyone in the room, the perceptions about others, and then in red you see the actual rate of people, the objective number of people who agree with the statement. And I also plotted the distribution of averages across the 17 sessions. So you see it's really to the right of the whole distribution of perceptions. This is wide variation in perception. I'm really gonna run out of time. There's no way I'm gonna finish this. This is more informative. I'm looking at individual level misperceptions, and a negative. This is a distance between your guess about your own session and the objective number. So a negative number means that you're originally underestimating. So you see over about 75% of participants are originally underestimating, but there's sufficient heterogeneity here, which we will exploit in our analysis. Understanding priors, back to and actually Harrison's question, to some extent, we asked again how confident they were with their guesses from 1 to 5, and here just to make sense of the priors, we see that people who were more confident are the ones who had more accurate prior perceptions, and monotonically you see that those with more correct perceptions also are less confident about them. Confidence correlates with number of people they know in the room, and they also end up being more accurate once they know more people. All right, correcting misperceptions, just to start showing some results. Impacts the sign-up decision. So we have this is just the raw data across all participants. 23% of people in the control group sign up for the service, and this goes up 32%. So we're not getting anywhere near 100, but there's a relative sizable increase in relative terms. Of course, when you start digging into the heterogeneity, we see for which people this is actually biting, but we see this is just the raw data. Now, in terms of longer term outcomes, we see that they're significantly more likely to have applied for a job. Their wives applied for a job outside of home within this 4 or 5 months window, from 5 to 16%. Significantly more likely, the numbers start getting pretty small, but we happen to be powered to get this interviewed for a job outside of home. Employed outside of home, we don't really have enough power for this. Got pretty wide confidence intervals. And then we wanted to see, is this driven mechanically by the service we're offering them, or there's something else going on, like about their beliefs and so on. So we tried to get a question that is less mechanically driven by the service, which is whether they will sign up their wife for driving lessons. This is a hypothetical question. And we see an effect 5 months down the road, which is suggestive that there's something extra going on. So we have all these different outcomes. Of course, we try an index. We also use the Jones method for adjusting for multiple testing here. And, we do a number of different things. Everything we do across our experiment was actually pre-registered, so our hands were tied ex ante. And one thing we asked, which I was interesting too, is their beliefs about their neighbors. 5 months down the road, we asked them, out of 30 randomly chosen neighbors of yours, how many of them you think agree with the statement? So do you have a persistent effect of this initial shock and beliefs? That's the question we asked. And there could go either way. The lack of a persistent shock could be that they either forgot, didn't care about it, or informational spillovers completely undid the intervention, right? So we do find a persistent effect, for 4 or 5 months down the road.
Just a quick question, Leo.
Yeah,
sorry, Leo,
just skip it. Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question about this of the effect in the short term versus the long term. So Julio Elias's question is, you'd expect a small effect on women's employment in the short run because they're likely to have low investment into sort of human capital and market abilities. And so it'd be interesting to see if this effect of investment in human capital sort of persists and gets larger over time, and whether
Very good
that's sort of
question. I
feeding
mean,
into
I agree with you. This is a very partial equilibrium short-term analysis. In general equilibrium, when, you know, it could be that women realize that it makes more sense to invest in human capital. Companies might start posting more jobs. Of course, absolutely. We have to qualify that. I'll have to skip this figure. I like the figure, but I have to skip it. Again, heterogeneity, the effects are driven by men who originally overestimate how conservative other men are. So if you look at the left side, those who originally had the negative wedge are the ones who really adjust their behavior. But we don't see that for the other side. Of course, most of our samples on the left side, so the confidence intervals are tighter there. Interestingly, you see that the control group correlationally behaves like the treatment group, which is something interesting. It's not always the case with experiment. So those in the control group who were positive about other men's support behave similarly to the treated participants in the other group. So I think it's kind of reassuring. This is just in regression form. This is using the continuous update. So we can use a continuous measure instead of just a dummy positive or negative. It works through that too. We find no evidence when you ask them how many jobs are there out of 100 companies, how many of them are willing to hire women to work inside a home. We don't see an effect of a treatment on this. We do a couple of other things to rule out, you know, to argue that it's not driven by learning about the labor demand side. So reassuring, it doesn't seem to be driven by that. Phew. I have 3 minutes. I have like 4 different experiments to go through now. Maybe 45 seconds each.
So Leo, we've bothered you a bit, so take a few more minutes. We've bothered you through this, okay?
All right. Thank you. All right, so we did this representative sample of 1,500 Saudi men in the same age range using a very similar layout and platform. Here we find 82% of them agree with the statement, as opposed to 87 we had there. Average guess is 57%, and 92% underestimate the true share. Now we're asking them to guess how other respondents of the survey, so not about their neighbors. So the misperception is even stronger. If you use these experiments as opposed to direct questions, you get 80 or 82%. So this, you know, trying to offer them more cover in this solicitation doesn't change. Paying people to guess or asking them to guess how others think generates nearly identical distributions in terms of their beliefs. In another yet another survey, 84% of them support the statement, very similar to the previous numbers, very similar misperceptions and so on. And we asked them how often they communicate to their male friends and relatives on the subject of women should be allowed to work outside of home. About 60% of them report that they rarely or very rarely talk about it. Most importantly, their perception correlates very strongly with how often they talk about it. So those who talk very often are very close to the true number here, which I thought was kind of cool. And then you see this kind of decreasing. I mean, suggestive, but it's just correlation, but it makes sense given our story. The Eurobarometer had a very similar question in 2010. 80% of men, 79 agree. You see, the numbers are always around 80%, which makes me think there's something really going on there. Here we have some data for older people, 74% of agreement about those over 35. But you know, if you start increasing the age, the number starts going down. But again, you start running to really small samples. But here, across all samples, very remarkable stability of the number. I'll dedicate 5 minutes to this experiment because I think I like it. I think it's kind of cool, and it took us a whole year. We partnered with this large Saudi survey company, and we did an experiment to recruit temporary enumerators earlier in 2020, this year, in 3 cities. Complements our original approach and provides proof of concept, this communication with the woman on how a conceptual contribution can be easily actionable in terms of policy. So a company first called these women in their database following a harmonized script to have the demographic information, confirm their interest in an opportunity for a one-day enumerator job calling response from home. So it's temporary, okay? I have to say it's just a one-day job. We didn't have money to do more of that. The pay rate is 25 Saudi riyals per hour, 200 per day, which is standard, this type of work. Then when they get the second call, there's a second intervention. So about 300 women in the age 18-35 were offered the choice between doing the job as previously agreed upon for 200 Saudi riyals per day, or doing the same job for the same survey, but conducting face-to-face interviews in shopping malls, so outside of home. We offer 20% more, 250 riyals per day, plus the company pays for all transportation costs. So it's more profitable, the second option, the reasonable assumption about the opportunity cost of time for commute, but it involves work inside a home, outside of home, which is potentially stigmatized. And they were told they would have to interview men in both cases, okay? So, you know, so we hold the job fixed to the extent possible, but just varying whether it's observable, it's outside of home or not, right? So it's closer to kind of a cleaner manipulation. Right before they offer the choices, randomization at individual level, a control group is simply told about the company's stance on women working as female labor force participation, just to try to reduce the extent of experimental demand effect. So it's clear that the company should be pretty obvious as a company hire women that they support women working, but you know, I want to make clear. And then in the information group, we did the same, plus we tell them the results from our recent survey that 82% of men agree with the statement. In my opinion, women should be allowed to work outside of home. It means that the vast majority of young Saudi men support women that work inside of home. So we vary this one element, whether the job is to be outside of home or not, and keeping things as similar as possible, and do this information or intervention. Very simple. Now results. This is just what they chose during the call. You see, we basically doubled the share of women who choose the job outside of home as opposed to the job inside at home. You know, we might be more interested not in their choice there, but whether they show up to do the job, right? More administrative data from the company, whether these women showed up, and we see that a big increase too. I mean, it's lowered because some of them say yes and don't show up for a variety of reasons, but we see that they go from 15 to 26%. So a pretty sizable increase in relative terms just by providing this information and whether they show up. So we think of this as kind of proof of concept in terms of policy. So just to wrap up, since I ran a little bit over time, we find that the vast majority of married men in Saudi Arabia privately support women working inside of home, while they vastly underestimate the level of support by other men, including their own neighbors. Correcting these beliefs about others affect their wives' labor supply decisions. So we do this in a more controlled environment, targeting men and measuring beliefs and so on. We replicate with large surveys, and we also implement this in the field as, you know, as in a recruitment experiment with an actual company, and just thinking that, showing that if you target women directly, you can also get an effect there. These results might help understand the role that social norms play in constraining women working outside of home in Saudi Arabia. Actually, you know, potentially in other countries as well. The World Bank has done a similar study, sort of replicating what we did, finding that in Jordan, similar patterns. So understanding how common these misperceptions are. I think, broadly speaking, understanding misperceptions, I think is a very interesting question. And if I had more time, I'll talk to you about potential ideas for research and have some brainstorming. But, you know, these results also suggest that these constraints might be lifted by simple provision of information. So the easiest way to change norms is when they're sustained by incorrect beliefs, right? That's the low-hanging fruit. So other types of norm changes could be much more difficult. There's evidence that norms can be remarkably persistent over time. But, you know, in cases where they're sustained by misperceptions, provision of information can actually lead to welfare improving changes. So understanding how common these misperceptions are around the world and so on, and the potential role for information provision to correct them is, I think, is an interesting avenue for future work. And with that, I end. Thank you.
Leo, that's super. Thank you so much. Let's jump to a few questions. And this one is shared by a few people, Don Wang and Glenn as well. So they want you to give more flavor around what is the social norm. And in particular, you know that behavioral economists for years, psychologists have talked about trying to define norms and social norms. And Bitchery talks about norms as consistency of first order descriptive beliefs about some behavior, second order beliefs about that behavior, first order normative beliefs about that behavior, and second order normative beliefs about that behavior. And then, of course, folks are willing to sanction deviations from the point of beliefs. Now, what Glenn says is you do some of these, but not all. So kind of he and Dawn are both saying, what actually is your definition of norm? And what do you think you're shifting?
A very good question. I mean, we take a very Benabutirol-like view here, which is defining norms as the set of the perceptions about the set of sanctions and rewards associated, social sanctions and rewards associated with an observable action. So is my beliefs about how the social sanctions and rewards I'm going to get when people observe the way I'm behaving. And then we have a very simple way of thinking about this is that we have this mapping. I mean, it's very reduced form. This is one-to-one mapping about between my beliefs about the share of people. If you think about a binary opinion, women should be willing to work outside of home or not, is my perception about my social reward or social sanction is proportional to my beliefs, to my belief about the share of people who hold this opinion. Okay, so there's a probability. So think about binary communication setup. I get matched with someone, and there's a if I get matched with someone, there's a probability that that person agrees with the statement, or there's a probability that the person disagrees with the statement. And my perception is my belief about this probability that the person agrees or not with the statement. And then if the person agrees with the statement, then they will give me, I'm gonna get a utility boost when I talk about it, when I have my wife work inside of home. If they disagree with it, I get an utility cost. That's how we think about it. Very reduced form, very simple, without much of a micro foundation and so on. For example, we're not allowing for like more than 2 opinions. We're not allowing for people with more extreme views, which is possible. It could be that some people care a lot about this, and if I happen to run into one of them, the sanctions could be stronger and so on. We don't, zoom into these options. We have a very simple model there. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Leo. So one other question by Michelle Brock, which is, do you have a sense of the threshold level of societal support that would be needed to lead to a positive outcome of more women working outside the home? So would you expect a different effect if the approval rate was 60%? And at what point do you think it could be counterproductive to correct misperceptions?
Extremely cool question. In fact, we don't here. We don't have enough data. I've been planning a project on a very similar topic, on this topic, on tipping points, eliciting kind of contingent actions of people based on realizations of actual beliefs and of actual share of people who agree with the statement to actually exactly get that. Where's the tipping point? And there could be heterogeneity. Maybe some people I need 50% of people to agree with it for me to come out. Some people are more conservative. They might need 80%, and just plotting this distribution, just the exercise, I think would be very cool. So start some sort of like BDM, I don't know, some sort of elicitation for like more continuous would be very cool. Should talk to you, Rob, because, that makes me think of your YMCA paper with, Anyway, but I think it's a very important question and we don't have the answer to that yet. Yeah.
Leo, a few people raised the level of stakes question. Farhad Majid said, how much is $5 US as a ratio of their monthly income? And other people talk about the incentivization almost being hypothetical. Maybe you can comment a little bit about how you're thinking about the incentives.
A good question. I mean, for the incentivization, I mean, it's $20 for a gift card if you get it right. If they're the most accurate. So if you divide by the number of, it's not huge stakes. I mean, listen, these beliefs seem to have very strong predictive power in terms of heterogeneity, which makes me confident about it. But one could always argue that, well, maybe you should have paid more and so on. I honestly, yeah. And then for the outcome, which I think could be more interesting question too. We're talking about, I don't know how you think about stakes here. Is it the $5 or is it their opportunity that they're foregoing? If they take the $5, is opportunity to help their wives get a job and so on, which might be much more valuable than $5, right? I mean, I could have been, if my design was a design where I was actually trying to get people to forego something instead of getting something, I wouldn't even need to give the $5 option. Like, I've done some work with SAT prep where I just offer the package. There's no alternative. Actually, the reason why I put the $5, it could have been $1. I just wanted to get rid of people who were saying yes to the service, because even though they didn't want it. So I think the more relevant measure of stakes is how much they think this service is valued at. I mean, I wish I could have given them the price. I didn't know what the price was. The company didn't have that price in mind. Certainly think it's more than $5. But I think that's a more relevant measure of stakes. But then again, in the recruitment experiment, we're talking about their willingness, to take a job and go outside of home and so on. I think that speaks more to the aspect of stakes. But I agree with you. I mean, it's an experiment where we try to have reviewed preference, and one can argue whether they think the stakes are high enough. Yeah.
Cool. Just one last question, Leo, about the sort of the generalization of your theory and your design. So there's a question by Annette John, which is, these jobs like enumerator seems very neutral. Do you think this design would work well if the females were going into a shopping center where they're shop assistants, as opposed to a more male-dominated workplace?
Very good question. I mean, the reason why, again, there's an aspect of external validity that we have to discuss here. We're speaking of a specific type of job, which is enumerated and so on. We thought this was an interesting job because it's a job where you have two versions of the same job. They're very similar, which you can call from home, or you can do it in a public environment in a mall. So we could hold this fixed, and some other jobs would be more difficult to have this just vary whether it's at home or outside of home. So that's part of the reason we did it. These are women who are going to be in malls interacting with men, right? So, it's, and we make it clear that they're going to be serving men only and so on in malls. So I think there is, some exposure there and so on, but I agree with you. I mean, we cannot speak to the effects that we're going to have for a broader range of jobs. And I think more work is needed there. Again, as I said, this is kind of halfway between like a clean behavior experiment, like the ones we do, and a kind of a more like broader, less clean development like experiment where, you just do like administrative data randomized within a whole state and so on. So we try to kind of have something between here, like kind of a policy proof of concept type of exercise. But I agree that more work is needed to go all the way to the big policy questions and large scale and thinking about, general equilibrium effects and so on. I think definitely more work is needed there. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Leo. Yeah, I'll pass over to John for closing comments, but thank you for the talk, Leo.
Thank you guys. This is fun. Yeah.
Yeah, that was, Leo, that was tremendous. And Alessandra, Leo, congratulations. Really nice paper. I want to, we have a ton of other questions that we'll send you. That is right in the Q&A cache. I want to say thanks a lot, everyone, for participating. It really is amazing that we've been able to keep up the numbers and people have continued to come. And I think it's just a testament to the great speakers that we've had. So thanks so much, Leo. And
thank you.
And I'm going to bid everyone goodbye. I want to wish for your continued health and safety and remain productive. And I hope to see you next week.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Next week is Jacob Golden from Stanford talking about health insurance and mortality. So looking forward to seeing you all then. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome.